In studying the Nazi doctors, that was really a journey into evil, and it had all kinds of problems for me, which I describe in my book. But what I learned was that immersion in evil is all too easy to make. Most of the Nazi doctors whom I interviewed or learned about were not ideological fanatics. They were ordinary people who had joined the Nazi movement, had some anti-Semitism, had seen a revitalizing force in the Nazis, as many Germans did, but hadn't killed anybody until they got to Auschwitz or to a so-called euthanasia killing center. They could be socialized to evil. They would adapt to killing when it was the norm in a particular environment. And that's another important insight. It's related, of course, to what I just said about the atrocity-producing situation, because these tell us how much a wrongly directed, a malicious environment can enter into the psyche of those who become part of it. We think of socialization as sort of superficial, but when you talk about socialization to evil, it can reach deep into the mind and produce this kind of behavior. The Nazi doctors was the most difficult personal study, not only because I'm Jewish, but because it was so much hands-on evil as compared to other studies that I did. And finally, I end the book with a more general section which I call next steps, and the idea is that one has to have gone back into that to move ahead with new work and new ideas in one's life. And I call one chapter Coming Home, and a lot of coming home involves returning especially to Cape Cod, where I've lived part of the year for almost half a century, and how much that means to me, and having that landscape as a counterforce to the things I was studying. Also with various dialogues with friends there and elsewhere, and the Wellfleet Psychohistory Group, the group that I've been hosting for 45 years on psychology and history and some of these issues that I and others have been probing. And then finally, what I call full circle, and I'll just mention that in finishing my remarks, each of those studies had all too much relevance for my own country, and that's what I mean by full circle in many ways, so that the thought reform study had all too much applicability to extremist groups, right-wing groups in this country, particularly cultish groups of varying kinds, and they do endanger this country. We've seen all too much evidence of the kinds of violence that kind of totalism, American totalism, can bring about, and in its application in the world, especially during the Bush administration, but not only during the Bush administration. And as for Hiroshima, the whole problem of nuclearism, as I call it, or the embrace of nuclear weapons as necessary, as even saviors, and I have something to say about that in my work and in this book, and we still see that in this country. Our president now, Obama, has done us the service of advocating the elimination of nuclear weapons, but he hasn't always followed up that dedication or that promise with actions sufficient to that project. My study of the Vietnam War, as I indicated, has all too much relevance for what we're doing in Iraq and yes, Afghanistan as well. These are both counterinsurgency wars. We see all too many atrocities. We see atrocity-producing situations in them that one could document. And these are endeavors that are self-defeating and harmful to the world. There was a necessity to go after bin Laden after 9/11. He had attacked us, and there was no way in which America could not respond, but it didn't have to invade either Iraq or Afghanistan with the misguided ideas of remaking either or both of those countries to do that. So I believe, anyhow. Finally, even Nazi doctors, I say with some pain, has more relevance to America recently than one would ever have imagined. One only need look at American physicians' collusion in torture. And I wrote a piece in the New England Journal of Medicine a few years ago talking about American doctors' collusion in torture by not reporting wounds that could only be caused by torture, by falsifying or delaying death certificates, and by collaborating with interrogators as interrogation moves over into torture, as it does. And some of that has been confronted by the American Psychiatric Association, a little more reluctantly by the American Psychological Association, but it hasn't been confronted by American leaders. And this is getting directly political, but why not? My two most severe constraints about Obama, whom I think we must support and is perhaps the best kind of president we could produce at this time, but I cannot forgive either his mistakes in Afghanistan or his blocking, not only his unwillingness to confront torture on the part of Americans, but his blocking of attempts to have a minimal confrontation, which I think is necessary for the ethical life of our country and for all of us. Having said all that, which doesn't sound so cheerful, the book is written with a sense of hope. And I talk also, besides the hope, I talk also about a sense of absurdity and the kind of gallows humor that one requires to immerse oneself in this kind of material, including, in my case, the drawing of ostensibly humorous bird cartoons, which mock just about everyone and everything, including quite centrally myself. Anyhow, people say to me often, okay, you've done these things, what do you think of humankind now? And they expect me to say, not much. But I say something else, we can go either way. We have the capacity to annihilate ourselves, to embrace in ways that I've tried to describe and witness the most destructive kind of behavior. We also have the capacity to embrace life-enhancing behavior, more harmonious behavior, and there are all sorts of examples of that in my study, including examples of resilience that are very striking and moving. That's as much as I will say. I'll end with a quotation that I like to use because it says a lot about my perspective and says a lot about the world. Theodore Rutger, the American poet, who said very simply, "In a dark time, the eye begins to see." Thanks. Thanks so much. Now you've heard me sound off, I'd like to hear from you. Any thoughts or questions or, yes?
So you've worked a lot with people who have been through like kind of indoctrination as well as people who have drifted. Do you think it's possible for people who have been indoctrinated like in China or who have drifted like the Nazi physicians who are normal people and then committed atrocities for them to come back? And which is it harder, in your opinion, to come back from?
In my work on Nazi doctors, I was troubled but not entirely surprised by the fact that not one Nazi doctor I interviewed or came upon through my readings ever expressed direct remorse and said, I did wrong or evil things, which I deeply regret. And I learned from another partial mentor, a German psychoanalyst named Alexander Mitscherlich, who was the first to expose Nazi doctors at Nuremberg, and he was an anti-Nazi German of that generation, and he said, their immersion into evil has been so profound that they can't confront it. The psyche can't manage that kind of confrontation. with Chinese thought reform, it's a different kind of story. It's more a kind. It isn't as centrally and evil as we're talking about with Nazi doctors, and the reform process was only partially successful with most people. It could, with Chinese intellectuals, set the contours of behavior that one could express in communist China, and some underwent conversions, but others were aversive to it finally and reacted the other way. And there's one interesting point that I came to, is that the Chinese themselves were so impelled to reform in a religious-like fashion, although it was, of course, a secular doctrine, that even when they were over-reforming, they couldn't stop reforming. And people increasingly turned against them. The whole Chinese story is fascinating because now there's very little, nobody believes in Chinese communist ideology anymore. Thought reform is a kind of punishment and an effort to convert people whom they don't like, but it doesn't have that exhortative force that it had when they came in as heroic winners of the Chinese Revolution. At that time they were incorruptible, now they're nothing but corrupt. So you can see, through no effort of one's own, an incredible change in a generation over that. So that's a partial answer to your question. Yes?
I just wanted to go back to your note of optimism and resiliency applications, and just tell you that your research has had cross-cutting interdisciplinary impacts. I'm an economist and I work on critical infrastructure, and I love your book on protein cell, and I've used it actually as a model of infrastructure resiliency, although it's a whole discipline in engineering. But that it's a marvelous framework for analyzing not only individuals but also societies under pressure, and kind of using the elements of resiliency, adaptiveness, fault tolerance, and mitigation to actually look at entire society's infrastructure as well as individuals.
Thank you so much for saying that. And the book that you referred to, The Protean Self, is, I didn't mention it, but it is perhaps my most hopeful book, and it's something I believe in terms of the capacity of the self under certain conditions and to varying degrees at certain historical moments, the self to be for multiplicity, for change, for avoiding dead ends, and even for transformation. And that's part of that hopeful direction of my work. I wouldn't call it optimistic, but I'd call it hopeful. And there is a difference in the sense that optimism means one expects good things to happen, whereas hope means that one always embraces the possibility for good things or for positive human developments. But yes, I mean, what you say and my own idea about resilience and hope are very much important themes in my work. Yes?
Do you anticipate that you or someone else would do studies of this type for those who have been at Guantanamo and have been through their supposed enhanced interrogation techniques, to do a comparison and contrast with the studies you've already done?
I haven't studied such people. There have been groups who have admirably probed the effects of torture on people. If you're talking about the torture at Guantanamo, and there's been more than a full share there, who have studied the effects of torture, which are strong and powerful and often debilitating, and that often gives one the impression that the purpose of torture on the larger scale may be less that of extracting information, in connection with which it's quite unreliable, than that of destroying people and expressing one's power over other human beings on a collective, often national basis. Yes?
Writing a memoir necessarily requires looking backward at things that you were looking at, at the time. What's been the most I don't know, illuminating thing, to startling thing to say, wow, it sure looks different from this angle than it looked. You know, when you saw
The most startling or surprising thing?
Or illuminating.
Illuminate.
Let's pick one.
You know, I expressed that moment of. Let me say something first, and then I'll answer your question. That is, when I did these studies, I realized that I was witnessing and confronting and trying to take in, through my mind, things of very extreme nature that I had never personally experienced. And a lot of what I was doing was translating words that were expressed to me into images. So the man I described before, and this was as illuminating as anything I've experienced, who looked down from that little hill on the outskirts of Hiroshima and said Hiroshima had disappeared. As he said that, through my mind went images of an emptiness. And then Hiroshima as it was before, some image of a city, and then Hiroshima gone. That kind of experience in its very extremity was illuminating. I can say something else that was illuminating. In working with anti-war veterans, it was very powerful for me in the rap groups that we formed together with the veterans. They always belonged to the veterans. But veterans could undergo changes, very dramatic changes, not only in opposing the war, though that was powerful, in their worldview in general, in their sense of being men and their macho inclinations that had gotten them into the mess in the first place, and in their relationships with girlfriends and with family and others, and they could change significantly in a few months, even in a month or two. Of course, some things stayed the same, but having been taught in my profession that everything, to exaggerate a bit, everything beyond the age of 6 is superstructure, because we're so formed early, and there's a partial truth to that, this was illuminating in a psychological way to see how much people could change, especially when the motor for that change was the confrontation with death and the rejection of any meaning in that death immersion. So those are a couple of the illuminations that I experienced. In a way, there were many, and there wasn't one Sartori moment so much as a series of experiences in which I changed and had to change just to take in and respond to what I was being exposed to.
In the process of writing a memoir, was there any illumination in that you were looking back?
In writing the memoir, yes. Writing any book is a slow, methodical process. You work and you try to get a few pages done every day. But a memoir is special because you're probing yourself, and you're looking for a voice, even though you thought you always had a voice. And I guess I always did have a voice, but I didn't clearly know what it was until I started to articulate it. And so the process of writing a memoir is finding a voice, not only in the sense of having one's place and opinions, but a mode of expression, a level of discourse about which to describe oneself. And of course I changed, thought about various aspects of my past in slightly different ways, but there wasn't any completely dramatic reversal of ideas. It was rather coming to grasp them and have more nuance about them, and to recognize the struggles and the conflicts that one has along the way. Yes?
The last time I saw you was also the last time I saw Howard.
Yeah.
You were having lunch.
Yeah, right. I remember.
In Square. And a friend had asked me to get a book signed by Howard, and you wanted Howard to write for justice. So I made it clear to Howard that this is what the friend had wanted. Would you please put for justice? And Howard paused, and you were across the table, and he said, Howard, how do you feel about that? Which it was a nice moment.
Yeah.
I'd be interested to hear you talk a little bit more about your relationship with Howard as a friend, if you care to. But I'm also intrigued, intrigued maybe isn't the right word, but a little distressed after what you said about Obama, to hear you say, we have to support him anyway, and I'd like to hear why you think we
Yeah.
have to support
Okay.
him anyway.
All right, two large questions which I'll give small answers to.
Would you mind repeating the question into the mic for the people in the back?
Oh, yeah, sure, absolutely. As for Howard, I think he was the great, the great activist of our generation. He lived that life of activism, and he also, in his way, brilliantly brought together scholarship and activism, especially in his People's History of the United States, which itself was a book about activism and a scholarly study of it. What I'd say about Howard, we were good friends over many years, and even the little story you told is indicative, because we were always laughing. We talked a lot about war and peace and terrible things, but we talked more about making jokes, baseball, which we both loved, and other things. And in the kind of activism that I most like and try to embrace, there's room for fun and humor, and in fact you damn well need it along the way, and I felt so much of that with Howard. As for your second question, yes, I believe we should rally round Obama with all his imperfections, and I think we should do that by applying very strong pressure of opposition to stands he's taking. I mentioned torture and Afghanistan. There are others, insofar as we see them, but there is there is a reality to the political life, and I think I guess my own model, for better or worse, is to be highly critical of the powers that be, and often, and most often, outside of the electoral system in the various movements I've been part of, and that was certainly Howard, but also to look at the electoral system as a reality that we have to face, and the pain, the added dimension of pain and danger that we'd be exposed to if he were defeated, for instance, in the next presidential election. Just as long as it's come up, and then I'll stop with this added part to the answer. I think Obama is a very decent man who is confusing, because on the one hand he's visionary, on the other hand he's very conservative and cautious and very politically minded, spending a lot of time to positioning himself for, as he's doing rather effectively, for the coming election. So, and I think there is something exciting about having, one has to have room in one's minds for seemingly antithetical views, because they can both be true. So whatever I've said in criticism of Obama, I mean very strongly, but there's also something exciting about, yes, having the first black American, but more than that, a black American of real decency and compassion, despite the shortcomings as our president. Yes.
As I read your marvelous memoir and got to the part of the Nazi doctor, I wondered about what I would have done in the situation that they were in. Did that question ever come to your mind?
What I would do if I'd been a Nazi doctor? Well, I would have tried to avoid being a Nazi doctor, and of course, as a Jew, I wouldn't be eligible. But still, I think the question you're raising is a profound one. How would one of us, and this often came to my mind, behave over those pressures toward socialization to evil? It isn't confined to Nazi doctors. You find it in all genocides, including early American genocides. In a way, the atrocities like My Lai in the Vietnam War were a form of socialization to evil and an atrocity-producing situation. What would you or I have done in that situation? We can't answer. I ask myself what I would have done, in a way, I felt myself rather identified with the prisoner doctors, especially Jewish prisoner doctors, who were sort of like me, with a middle-class background, similar intellectual backgrounds, maybe 10 or more years older than I was, but I kind of identified with them. And of course I asked myself, what would I have done if I had been a prisoner or prisoner doctor in Auschwitz? And I say I don't think I would have done as well as a couple of them that I mentioned. There's usefulness in raising that question, not to drown in it and say, oh, it's hopeless, I wouldn't have done anything, but to examine the situation and oneself and what it might take to help one avoid the effects of an immersion in evil. And those helping factors could be understanding the process in advance, and of course having prior to that elements of conscience which matter, and also the capacity to form groups that take an alternative to the socialization to evil. That's a very quick summary, but we do well to raise that question. Not to say we're all Nazis and there's no difference, that's not the case, but rather there's something universal about the vulnerability to socialization to evil.